So thank you for sitting down with me. Dr. Martin Blackwell, can you tell me a bit about your experience teaching before Stetson?
Teaching before Stetson, yeah. I've been a full-time history professor for 14 years. I taught at Central Arkansas for a couple of years, and then I taught at North Georgia, University of North Georgia for 12 years. And back in May, my wife became the dean here, so she's the dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, and I was invited to be a visiting professor of history here. So I have a lot of experience teaching upper-level Russian history courses and a whole bunch of experience teaching lower-level survey courses, particularly the World History Survey. And when it comes to Russia and points east, I've done a lot of stuff on, courses like you have already here at Stetson, on the Russian Empire, on the Soviet experiment, the Soviet century, as you guys call it. I also have a couple courses on nationalism in Russia, which I'm going to hope to do here at Stetson, as well as course on war and society in 20th century Russia, which segues out of my book that I wrote on Ukraine after World War II. So I mean, I'm ready to go when it comes to what Stetson has on its books already, and hopefully I'll be able to add, along with Dr. Fowler, to Spreece's coterie of professors and courses going forward.
Yeah. Tell me a bit about your book. It's on post-World War II Kiev Reconstruction, right? Right,
yeah. It's not simply really about like buildings being reconstructed. It's actually about how things Soviet were like, the ideology itself, what it meant to be a Soviet was reconstructed after the Nazis were, after Kiev was liberated from the Nazis on November 6, 1943. So it looks at how the city was repopulated, like how people came to live there, and it tells a story of how Kiev is a very multicultural place, a multi-ethnic place. Relatively quickly, when the war's over, it's majority Ukrainian, but there's also a big Jewish minority, almost 20% of the population, and a lot of Russians too live there. And it's also a story of how those people had a very difficult time finding places to live, and there were really big battles over housing, and ultimately the story is really very much about how the Kremlin and its henchmen there in Ukraine and Kiev really divide and conquer the city, such that Ukrainians are the first ones to arrive. The Ukrainians are allowed to keep the housing that they live in, even if they're there in questionable circumstances, and those who come later are not given such access to such housing. And so that is really the Jewish minority, and a lot of the anti-Semitism that you see there in post-war Soviet Union, it really is not really a result of any sort of ancient animosities or any sort of religious differences. It really has a lot to do just simply with terrible circumstances of survival and people sort of battling over apartments and things like that. And anti-Semitism really becomes a real modus operandus of the Soviet ideological complex, right? Such that, at least things are pretty bad here, but at least the Jews aren't going to succeed. That's one aspect of it all. And the other aspect of it is, Marx said that the state would wither away while we were building communism, but actually we really could use a strong state around here while we're building communism, because there are a whole lot of difficulties with law and order, right? And so like a strong state, a strong anti-Semitic state, that becomes the sort of wherewithal, that becomes what the Soviet Union sort of in a lot of ways stands for to its certainly its Russian and Ukrainian majorities going forward, all the way really to the end of the Soviet experience.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. That's what I do.
So it really seems like no one within the Reese arena really sets out to study something so specific such as that. How did you fall into your area of study? Yeah,
well, I mean, that might strikes people probably as pretty strange when you guys, your generation, World War II, you would think that would be certainly somebody who's actually lived there, like you did in Bishkek, and even in Central Asia, right? World War II is something that's felt strongly. It affected every family, right? Every Soviet family was affected by World War II.
Still feels like it happened yesterday for a lot of families. Well, certainly,
there's been the Putin regime really talks a lot about World War II as like the Soviet victory. Just simply that when I was growing up, when people thought about the Soviet Union, really they thought about the terror They thought about Stalinism. They thought about the battles between Lenin and Gang over what direction the Soviet Union would go in after the Civil War, after the revolution. I mean, it was really like a whole story of how, you know, Stalin took the place off in the wrong direction, and people thought about Soviet life. It was like the terror, right? People being picked up out of their apartments in the middle of the night. And like in a lot of ways, when I was your age, the Soviet history sort of ended in 1938, and yet I was a student in Volgograd in 1990. In Stalingrad, the old Stalingrad, and so like the terror was something that was very far away, very removed, but I mean, and it was important. But World War II was something that really affected everybody there. The terror really, as bad as it was a minority, a small minority of people who were affected by it, and so what I really wanted to do with the book is tell the story of how the Soviet Union survives the Nazi invasion. I wanted to tell the story of what the Soviet Union was like at the beginnings of the Cold War. And you know, who was the enemy there, and it was a very different place after the war. Not as optimistic a place, I don't think, as it was before the war. And it was a place that it took a very long while to recover, and it was sort of always hobbled and disabled by its war experience. And you know, that was something that was absolutely really ignored by scholars and historians before the 90s, before the archives opened.
Yeah. And how much of a, I mean, obviously it's been a large change, but how much of a change do you think the archives have made on this field of study?
They've made a huge difference. We have a much more nuanced take on what Soviet life was like. Things become a lot grayer. And you know, ultimately we of course found out that Stalin really was in charge, and of a lot of terrible things that happened, and in a lot of ways, the Soviet system, it doesn't come across as looking very good, obviously, as a result of what we found out from the archives. But yet we also learned a lot about how people kind of like survived and made do and did their best to succeed within its parameters. You know, there was a lot of stability in Soviet life for 40 odd years or so, at least, from the late 40s into the late 80s, and people are very nostalgic for that stability that existed, you know, back in those days. And there were a lot of really good things that happened, and that were completely passed over by the Cold War, passed over, you know, the people always thought of Soviet life as being evil and totalitarian and all that. So we have a much more nuanced, grayer look, but you know, in the end, it was a scene of a lot of deprivation and a lot of death.
Yes.
And one would hope that, you know, life there was getting better than it, even now, than it was, of course, back then.
Yeah. I think something that I really noticed, at least in Kyrgyzstan, was a lot of the older generations of Kyrgyz residents, like ethnically Kyrgyz residents, really had like a very strong longing for the Soviet Union, and like really had a very strong memory of the Soviet Union. And that's something that would come up in conversation very often.
Right.
Do you find the same, I guess, like reminiscence in Ukraine?
Yeah. The people long for the predictability of it all. That's interesting, that Lois, that you say that there's like a longing for it to return. I think that you know, in Ukraine, they have had some positive things happen in Ukraine. They've had a couple revolutions, the last one being the Revolution of Dignity. They have a very vibrant democratic life there, very, very dynamic democratic free press there. So there isn't as much nostalgia for Soviet times in Ukraine as compared to in Central Asia. Because of course Central Asia, right, they're living in, most of them all, in these authoritarian regimes that are very similar to the Kremlin's Russia. So
even with Kyrgyzstan, which is technically is in a hybrid regime, however you want to define that, right? I still think that many generations kind of feel that Kyrgyzstan gained a lot from the Soviet Union, to say the least.
Oh, definitely. I mean,
they went through incredible pain, but...
Well, yeah, I mean, certainly the Cossacks...
Many Kyrgyz are living in post-Soviet housing. They're still using Soviet infrastructure. And I think at least the old generations really focus on, I guess, that living standard.
Yeah, I mean, it was in some ways it was a place that was led by the Russians, but the Soviet Union was a very multicultural, very diverse place. Russian was the lingua franca. Things were connected through that. Now they're sort of all on their own, and in a place like Central Asia, there's a lot of poverty, a lot of extreme poverty that's a result of these last 28 years. So I could certainly sense why there would be some nostalgia. I simply think that in Ukraine, there were a lot of people in Ukraine who wanted to be independent of Moscow, and they've achieved that, right?
Yeah.
And there are not so many people in Kyrgyzstan who wanted to be independent of Moscow. There never really were. So,
which, to be fair, I mean, there are plenty of people who are so proud to be,
right,
I guess, independently Kyrgyz. Right? And I'd hate to make generalizations about Kyrgyzstan.
Yeah.
But it is interesting seeing the numbers of people who.
Yeah, I think you've obviously talked to a lot of people, and you've really come to a crux of the problem, right? I mean, what is really most important for people? I'm sitting here talking about free press and political parties and free elections and things like that. But I mean, the flip side is, what about like food on the table? What about utility bills being paid and things like that? So
about utilities being offered.
Right, utilities being offered. Yeah, so Lois, I mean, yeah, you've really hit the sort of sweet spot there with that, and people are going to have different opinions based off of what's happened to them over the last 28, 29 years. I think in Ukraine there have been more positives out of this experience of independence than what they've experienced in Kyrgyzstan, unfortunately. I mean, in Ukraine they're fighting this war. It's very been unjust the things that have happened to that country, and there's a real sense there that we got to go off on our own here. We can do it, and we don't owe as much to the Russians, to Russian culture, Russian civilization. I mean, think about Kyrgyz, Kazakhs. These are people who were completely illiterate, right, before Soviet times, and the Soviets created a language, created an alphabet, created literacy out of nothing, and so people do have some fond remembrances of what Moscow did for them. Whereas in Ukraine, I think there's often a sense that really we could have done a whole lot better around here if we'd been independent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for talking to me. We got a little bit off the tracks, but
we did. My book's in the library, so I mean, if a real paper copy. I presented to Dr. Sue Ryan, the dean there, a free copy. There's also Dr. Fowler had them buy an electronic version.
Yeah.
So there's an electronic version, and there's a paper copy of Kiev as regime city in there, and it's based off the archives. It's based off of a whole year on a Fulbright of my own working in the archives. So it's kind of an unparalleled chance to sit down and work for a very extended period of time. So definitely recommend getting a Fulbright at some point to do that sort of thing. So, thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I'm so excited to see what you do at Stetson and really just follow your career.
Appreciate it. All right. Take a class.
Yeah.